Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we are taking a really detailed, unhurried walkthrough of a truly foundational text. We are going to be unpacking Prophets, Judges chapter 2. This chapter is absolutely critical because it basically sets the blueprint for everything that follows in this era. So get comfortable and let's get into it.
Welcome to the Pardes channel. Today we explain Prophets, Judges chapter 2 in a clear and simple way, step by step.
Okay, so here is our roadmap for today. We are going to follow the chapters strictly in order. We'll start with the angel at Bochim, move on to how a generation forgets, look at their fall into idolatry, unpack the famous cycle of the judges, see how God tests the nation, and then wrap up with some practical lessons.
Let's start with section 1, the angel at Bochim. This covers verses 1 through 5. Right out of the gate, chapter 2 opens up with a highly dramatic scene. Joshua has led the initial settlement into the land, but the actual work, well, it's not fully complete. In verses 1 and 2, the angel of the Lord comes up from Gilgal and delivers a pretty severe wake-up call. The angel reminds them of God's faithfulness, saying, "I made you to go up out of Egypt. I will never break my covenant with you." It's a powerful reminder. But the Israelites had one very clear instruction. Do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land and break down their altars. Simple enough, right? Well, they totally disobeyed. And because of this broken covenant, the angel lays out the consequence in verse 3. God is no longer going to drive these surrounding nations out for them. And those local gods, they're going to become a trap, a literal snare for the people. Now, verses 4 and 5 show us the immediate, heavy fallout of this devastating news. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the children of Israel, the text tells us the people literally lifted up their voices and wept aloud. I mean, the grief here was just absolute. It was so intense, in fact, that they actually named the location itself after what happened. The Hebrew word Bochim translates directly to weepers, or the place of weeping. They fully realized the gravity of their failure, and following this really emotional breakdown, they offered sacrifices right there to the Lord. Moving on to section 2, a generation forgets. We'll be covering verses 6 through 10 here. You know, to understand how things got to this point, the text actually gives us a bit of a flashback to the end of Joshua's life. It points out that the people did serve the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and during the days of the elders who outlived him. But then we hit verse 10. And guys, this is the pivotal, tragic turning point of the whole text. It says, "After that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel." Think about that for a second. They didn't have a personal, experiential knowledge of him. The transmission of their own history, their core identity, had fundamentally broken down. Let's really look at the contrast between these two groups, because it's absolutely crucial to understanding the chapter. On one hand, you have the generation of Joshua. These people possessed a living, first-hand historical memory. They obeyed the commands of the Lord because they vividly remembered the Exodus and the sheer miracle of the conquest. Then, on the flip side, you have the new generation. Without that anchor of historical memory and personal experience, they turned aside incredibly fast. Because they hadn't internalized what God had actually done for Israel, they were highly susceptible to the culture around them. This stark contrast basically sets the stage for the disaster that follows. Which brings us to section 3, falling into idolatry. Let's look at verses 11 through 15. So what exactly did it look like when this new generation turned aside? The text doesn't sugarcoat it at all. They forsook the God of their fathers. Verse 13 specifically says they went and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. Now, you might be wondering, who exactly are they? Well, the Baals were local Canaanite storm and fertility gods. And the Ashtoreths, they were the primary fertility goddesses of the region. So instead of trusting the invisible God of Israel, who demanded strict moral obedience, this new generation decided to just blend in. They adopted the highly visible, local, and deeply corrupt religious practices of their neighbors, just to fit in. But listen, this assimilation came with some massive consequences, which are laid out methodically, step by step, in verses 14 and 15. Because they provoked the Lord to anger by abandoning him, God essentially removes his protection. First off, the text says the Lord's anger burned against Israel. Second, he handed them over to raiders who came in and plundered them. Third, he sold them right into the hands of their enemies all around, so they were no longer able to resist. Fourth, the text makes this incredibly striking statement. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was actually against them to defeat them, exactly as he had sworn to them in his covenant warnings. The ultimate result of all this? Great distress. When they abandoned the source of their strength, they were left entirely vulnerable.
Now we arrive at section 4, the cycle of Judges, covering verses 16 through 19.
Here is the amazing thing, though. Even in the middle of this great distress, God doesn't just walk away from his people. The text tells us he raises up judges. And a quick clarification, these aren't your typical courtroom judges. Think of them more as military deliverers. And this brilliantly illustrates the core structural framework for this entire era. It's a tragic 6-step repeating cycle. Let's walk through it. Step 1, Israel does evil. Step 2, God hands them over to their enemies. Step 3, Israel groans under this heavy affliction. Step 4, out of pure compassion, God raises up a judge to save them. Step 5, the judge eventually dies. And finally, step 6, the people don't just go back to their old ways, they immediately return to dealing even more corruptly than their fathers. It is a continuous, heartbreaking downward spiral. That brings us to section 5, testing the nation. We are looking at verses 20 through 23. Because of this stubborn, unbroken cycle, the chapter wraps up with a final, definitive decree from God. The conquest of the land is officially halted. God states he will no longer drive out any of the nations that Joshua left behind. But why leave them there? Verse 22 gives us the literal logic for this. God says, I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord. The enemies are left right there in the land as a constant daily test. It's an ongoing challenge, forcing this new generation to make a choice between the Baals of their neighbors and the God of their fathers. Finally, section 6, lessons and recap. Let's talk about some practical takeaways. So what does this all mean for us? We've seen the bitter tears at Bochim, the forgotten history, the trap of idolatry, that painful cycle, and God's ultimate test. Now let's distill this into some practical life advice that we can use today. First, remember your history. We literally have to actively remember the past so we don't repeat its exact same mistakes. Second, stay true to your covenants and your commitments. Third, take a hard look and recognize the negative cycles in your own behavior and actually work to break them permanently. And finally, understand that your daily struggles aren't just random. They can actually serve as a test to strengthen your resolve. Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to reflect on. Just as the ancient Israelites had those remaining nations left right there in their land to test their faithfulness, what nations are in your life? Meaning, what ongoing struggles, temptations, or negative cycles has God left in your own life to test your resolve? Identifying those is a genuinely powerful way to look at the challenges we face every single day. Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.